Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for everyone for giving up a portion of their evening to listen to the talk. I'm going to share a PowerPoint uh, just so you're aware. Sometimes when I'm doing this, it's a little bit of a strange thing because you can't see everybody, so I sort of hide everybody, and you're not always sure if people are still there at the end. So if people are putting their questions and queries and stuff in the chat, that's really helpful. I won't be looking at that as I go along, but yeah, it will be nice to get into the Q&A session part of it, because really the presentation bit with slides always feels a bit peculiar when you're not in person and can't actually make eye contact with people. So the topic of the talk is the trouble with faith schools campaigning against illegitimate religious influence in education, but it should really be the trouble with faith in schools, because we're not just going to focus on what are traditionally known as faith schools. So I'm going to be talking more broadly than that. Before we get started, it's probably a good idea to just share a little bit of information about me and my background and how I ended up doing what I'm doing. I used to be a primary school teacher. I taught in schools in and around Birmingham and the West Midlands for in the range of 6 years. I taught in lots of different types of schools. That includes schools with religious character and schools without a religious character. And it was really my work there that sort of prompted me, moved me onto a path of thinking about how we deal with religion in education. I was actually a religious education coordinator at a primary school in Birmingham and was very interested in teaching religious education. But it always struck me, particularly when I was training to be a teacher and was working in a school that didn't have a religious character, that we would often talk about religion and belief in God as though it wasn't controversial. And it was interesting to note children's reactions to that. So one of the sort of pivotal moments for me in sort of thinking about these issues was talking to a group of children in year one, where we were talking about different kinds of rules. We were going to be moving on to a lesson on the Bible and the Ten Commandments, and we were talking about the rules that children had to live by and the rules that adults had to live by and whether they were different. And I asked the children if there were any rules that adults had to live by as well as children. So we'd done sort of school rules, and you have to wear a uniform in school and that sort of thing. And I was trying to get at the idea of laws, sort of universal laws or laws of countries and that kind of thing. And one child said, "You have to believe in God, that's a rule." And it felt really tricky talking about that as a trainee teacher and sort of saying, well, you know, some people believe that that's the case, that you have to believe in God, but actually, you know, that isn't a rule as such. Although little did I know at the time, because it was pre-2008, it was actually a rule, because we still had blasphemy laws at that point in time. But it was just interesting to me that it almost felt, I mean, I can only think of a religious word to describe it, almost felt kind of heretical to say, well, I don't believe that that's the case, but you are perfectly free to believe that that is the case. And even though I wasn't in a religious school, it still felt like I shouldn't be saying that sort of thing. And it was those kinds of interactions in teaching that prompted me to go back to university. So I did, before I became a primary school teacher, I'd done a degree and a master's in philosophy. And so this prompted me to go back and do my doctorate, which was in philosophy of education, and focused on the question of whether faith schools are legitimate in liberal democratic societies. So I was really interested in the question of whether it was okay to treat these controversial issues, or issues that were controversial amongst citizens in liberal societies, as non-controversial when you were talking to children in schools. I mean, obviously my intuition ahead of this was that no, it wasn't, but I wanted kind of proper arguments for that, not just to assume that that was the case. So I went and did my doctorate in philosophy of education at the University of Birmingham, and following that, having focused a lot on those sort of theoretical questions about, you know, why was this problematic theoretically speaking? So I argued quite a lot about the fact that when we teach children things as true, when actually those things are contested, that we override their rationality and we override their autonomy. But I wanted to then really think about, well, what did that mean in practice? So from my doctorate, I moved on to work as a postdoctoral research fellow on a project at the University of Warwick in their Department of Political and International Studies. And it was a more practical project there, where we were actually looking at the law as it pertains to faith schools in England, and what we ought to be doing given the theoretical arguments and the various sorts of constraints that there are on what we can and can't do, including things like international law. And if you're interested in that pamphlet, it was written for a general audience. It's not a horrible, weighty academic tome, which I must confess that the thesis is. This is actually quite a short, accessible pamphlet, and it's free to download on that link, and I'm happy to send round the slides after this. And so having then got a bit of a taste for what we can do, what's practically achievable, how the law ought to change to accommodate various theoretical arguments, just at the end of that project, it happened to be the case that the education campaigns manager role at Humanists UK was being advertised, which seemed like a perfect fit given my background. So I've moved from very kind of theoretical concerns about whether this was morally right or wrong to actually really thinking about how we needed to change the system in order to have one that was morally fit for purpose, I guess. And it seems to me that the work that Humanists UK was doing was just the sort of work that I ought to be doing given my theoretical background in this area. So what I'm going to do just before I kind of go through a whistle-stop tour really of all of our campaign areas is just give you a little bit of an overview about the different types of school that we have in England. And I'm only really going to focus on England with a little bit of a travel into Wales at some points, because they're actually doing some really interesting and innovative stuff with their curriculum in Wales that I think will mean that by 2021 it's one of the most inclusive in the world, and would be sort of something we would want to be seeing England move in a similar direction to, but unfortunately I'm not sure how likely that is. So I'll have a little bit of a journey into Wales, but mostly the focus will be on England. I shan't say much about Northern Ireland because their education system is so very different to ours. But it does have some kind of certain messages that we might want to take heed of in terms of segregated education. So maybe if you wanted to talk about that, we could bring that up in the discussion, but mainly my focus is going to be on England here. So the thing worth saying is we have a very complicated school system, even just in England. So what I'm going to try and do is just equip you with the basic knowledge that you need in order to understand some of the stuff that's going to come up sort of later in the talk, just in case you're not already aware. So schools in England are divided into independent schools, which are also called private schools, and somewhat confusingly public schools, owing to the history of those schools. That gets very confusing when you talk to people who work on these issues in the States, because obviously they're public schools, they mean state schools, state-funded schools. But here I'll just refer to private schools if I'm referring to our independent schools. And then we have state-funded, sometimes known as maintained schools, and there's a whole variety of different types of state-funded school in the English system, and they are broadly split into academies and free schools. The only thing that you really need to remember when I use the term free school is that a free school is just a new academy. They are kind of like independently run schools, but within the state system. So they're state-funded schools, but they have more autonomy than other sorts of schools. Then we have voluntary aided schools. Most of these are religious in character, but there are 14 of them that aren't. I'm going to set those aside for our discussions here. The thing to remember about those is they're largely run by religious trusts, religious organisations, and they have a great deal of control over things that go on in the school, and that will include things like their admissions. So the main reason that I needed to divide up academies and free schools and voluntary aided schools is to do with the discussion that we're going to have later on, to do with admissions policies. Voluntary aided schools, when they have a religious character, can select up to 100% of their pupils on the basis of their faith. Voluntary controlled schools can also have a religious character, but they do not select children on the basis of faith, and they have a more open religious education curriculum. Voluntary aided schools with a religious character have their own religious education syllabus, and it's in line with the tenets of their faith, and it's also inspected by inspectors from the faith background. So Ofsted have no oversight of that religious education. Community schools are just the schools that quite often get referred to as secular schools or non-denominational schools for reasons that we'll cover later on. I don't think we can call them secular schools, because actually none of the schools that we have in England or Wales or Northern Ireland are appropriately called secular schools, because all have collective worship, Christian collective worship, which, whilst you have worship which is supposed to be focused on a particular faith, they can't really be called secular. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in the section when we discuss collective worship. And then there's trust or foundation schools, which, as the name suggests, tend to be run by a trust or a foundation. Some of those have religious character, some of them may not. So really, the main things you need to bear in mind for the rest of the talk are just the fact that academies and free schools have a little bit more autonomy, but they do have a cap on the number of faith-based admissions that they can have, unlike voluntary aided schools. So that draws us nicely into the next slide, which is focusing on admissions. So one of our key campaign areas, and it was actually in terms of the education campaign manager's work, particularly just before I started at Humanists UK, one of the key focuses of our work are religiously selective admissions policies. So as I've already said, there is a 50% cap on religious selection in new academies and free schools, or they're basically the same thing, new academies and free schools. So whereas voluntary aided schools with a religious character can select all of their pupils in this way, these schools are only allowed to select half of their pupils in this way. Now, you may have been aware at the time, but in 2016, the government suggested that it take away that 50% cap and allow those new academies and free schools with religious character to do what voluntary aided religious schools do and select all of their pupils. And there was a huge campaign, and in the end they ended up going back on that and keeping that 50% cap. Now, you might wonder why it was that they decided to initially propose that policy of taking away that 50% cap. It was largely because some of the religious organisations that run voluntary aided schools, particularly the Catholic Education Service and the Board of Deputies of British Jews, said that they would not open any free schools whilst the cap was still in place. And we're obviously in a situation where currently we don't have enough secondary schools to cover the rising number of secondary aged pupils. The government was rather desperate for new schools, and so where these religious groups were saying, well, we're not going to open new schools if we can't select all of our pupils on faith grounds, they were sort of caving in to that demand. Now, the public opinion against it was massive, and actually even amongst Catholics, which, bearing in mind that it was the Catholic Education Service who were the primary organisation who were fighting against this, was really interesting that around 70% of Catholics thought that there shouldn't be religious selection in schools and thought that the 50% cap should be retained. So that was really interesting. But when the government went back on this policy to get rid of that 50% cap, they also sort of gave with one hand and took away with the other, because whereas there had been something in place which meant that all new schools should be expected to be free schools, something known as the free school presumption, they decided that they would provide some funding for there to be some new voluntary aided schools. So although free schools couldn't select all of their pupils on faith grounds, they'll just build some new ones that were voluntary aided that could. Why are we against this sort of religious selection in faith schools? Well, of course, there's the fact that they're state-funded schools, so should be open to all, but also there's various evidence which shows how they're really problematic. One area of this is that religious selection tends to favour affluent families. So the children who tend to end up at faith schools tend to come from more affluent backgrounds with higher prior attainment. Now, it's not because the schools are selecting for those things, it's because religious selection acts as a proxy for being more affluent and from a higher attaining family. And also just that those families are more able to navigate the complicated system of selection, really. They understand what they need to do in order to meet the admissions criteria, etc. The thing about this is that it means that where faith schools are dominating the league tables, that's more likely to be because of this selectivity than something special about the school. It's not because they just are better schools. And quite often I have conversations with people about faith schools where they just say, well, you know, I don't necessarily think that religion should be involved in school, but they're just better, aren't they? They've got better discipline, they get better results. And it's because of this selection acting as a proxy for all these other things to do with the background of the children. The other thing worth saying is that diverse schools, so schools where pupils come from a variety of different backgrounds, are much better at fostering attitudes that are really conducive to social cohesion. What's interesting about the evidence on this is that some of the most persuasive evidence on it is research done by a group of researchers from the University of Oxford, which actually sits on the Department for Education's own website, which is about schools in Oldham where one school was predominantly white pupils and the other school was predominantly Muslim pupils, and they merged as a school. And it talked about how a longitudinal study following how the positive attitudes between different kinds of groups developed over time through this social mixing. I just find it really interesting that the government will maintain that faith schools and schools which are allowed to segregate in this way are perfectly fine to continue in our education system, all the while presenting this research on its own website. And I think the other thing worth pointing out is that those arguments against religious selection apply equally to all types of schools. So it's no use saying, well, in academies and free schools, we were persuaded that it was great that there was this 50% cap, but in voluntary aided schools, they need to be able to select 100% of their pupils. If these arguments apply, they apply to all schools. So this sort of asymmetry between policies governing different types of schools is unjustifiable, really. Okay, so submissions. And from admissions, we'll move on to relationships and sex education. So one thing that sometimes comes up when we discuss relationships and sex education is, why particularly does Humanists UK focus on relationships and sex education? What is it about an organisation that campaigns on issues to do with religion and belief that draws us into this sphere of education? Well, I think the key thing to say is that we're motivated from a children's rights focused approach to the issue. And we think that children have the right to knowledge which keeps them healthy and happy and safe. And quite often it is religion and religious belief that tries to deny children access to this kind of information. So you may be aware that as of September 2020, there's a statutory requirement for all secondary schools to teach relationships and sex education, and all primary schools to teach relationships education. Now, this is a huge step in the right direction, but there are all sorts of problems with the law as it's come in. One is the fact that primary schools may teach sex education, so they're enabled to. There's nothing prohibiting them from doing so, but they don't have to, so they can avoid teaching it altogether. Another is that there are various caveats in the law, and one of these is what we've called the faith school opt-out, and that states that this education must be appropriate with respect to the religious background of the pupils. This also comes out in the DfE guidance on the subject, that it must be appropriate to the background of the pupils, which sends the message, if not necessarily happening always in practice, that there is a way to veto certain content on the basis of the background of pupils. Now, that can happen perhaps in the way it happened in Birmingham last year, where noisy protests by parents who said, well, these children are Muslim children, so they shouldn't be being taught about LGBT, and we have a right to opt out on this basis. This is not appropriate for our children. So it can play out in that kind of a way. But the reason that it's also worth thinking about as a faith school opt-out is that faith schools can use it as a reason that they don't have to teach this content at all. And we've actually been aware of some Haredi Jewish schools in London putting pressure on parents on the basis of this kind of ability of the parents to withdraw their children and say, well, this isn't really appropriate for our religious background, and you can withdraw your children, so that they don't have to teach this at all. And the right to withdraw, we think, also from a children's rights perspective, is pretty problematic. It doesn't apply to relationships education now, but it does apply to sex education, at least until a child is 3 terms from their 16th birthday. Now, again, a step in the right direction, because it does enable older pupils to opt themselves into the lessons, but it does mean that parents can prevent them getting what could be life-saving information until they're really close to being 16, which just seems just too late. Effectively, what all this means is that although RSE is statutory, the content of it isn't, and religious carve-outs we think are likely to considerably stymie the efficacy of the requirement to teach the subject. So moving from, let me just move that over there. Moving from relationships and sex education, another area that we work in, and people are sometimes, I imagine that you guys will not necessarily be surprised by this, but people are sometimes surprised by this, that one of our main areas of campaigning is on access to what we call non-confessional religious education. So that's religion, education about religion, not education or instruction in religion. So, oh, sorry about this, I'm having a bit of a IT nightmare. There we go. So religious education is currently a statutory subject at all schools, so that's schools both with and without a religious character. Faith schools are legally permitted to meet their requirements via the provision of religious instruction that's taught from a particular faith perspective, so can teach certain faith beliefs as true. And so many of the pupils who attend faith schools are denied access to pluralist, non-partisan religious education, which we think is really necessary for them to make informed decisions about what they believe. So to actually have a chance to weigh up the different sorts of things that people believe and decide for yourself what strikes you as true, as well as to be able to live well with those with differing religions or beliefs, as you have to in a democratic society. So if you don't know anything about what Muslims believe, or what Catholics believe, or what Jewish people believe, or what humanists believe, then it's difficult to live in a society that is made up of people who hold all of these different beliefs, because you've never had any chance to understand them or think about their different practices and ways of living. However, that's not to say that attending a non-denominational school, a school that doesn't have a religious character, is a guarantee that you're going to receive good quality or indeed any religious education. So we're in a sort of peculiar situation where RE is a statutory subject at all schools, but quite often it isn't taught. Which seems bizarre, that you can have something that's held up in law as one of the few subjects that you absolutely have to teach, but you might not receive it at all, or you might not receive it taught in a very good way. Research that was done by I think it was the National Association of RE teachers, but I'm not entirely sure, found that nearly half of pupils in non-denominational academies received no designated religious education lessons when they were in Key Stage 4, so none at all. It's also often taught by unqualified teachers, so teachers who don't really have a background in religious education. And what counts as a qualified teacher is somebody who, for example, has a background in philosophy. Now, I have a background in philosophy, but I don't think there's anything about my philosophy degree that would have equipped me on its own to teach secondary religious education. So the fact that that's a qualifying subject tells you just how problematic it is at the moment, that in terms of critical expertise. In many schools, children aren't taught about non-religious worldviews like humanism in religious education, despite the fact that this is actually unlawful. There's actually only one piece of English case law on the subject of religious education, and it refers to when some humanist parents took the Secretary of State for Education to the High Court on the grounds that the specifications for the GCSE in religious studies did not include humanism, and the Department for Education produced guidance which said that this religious studies GCSE would meet the statutory requirement for providing religious education. And the case turned on the fact that because the religious studies syllabus was not sufficiently critical, objective and pluralistic, because it didn't include non-religious worldviews, then religious studies GCSE was not going to meet this statutory definition of religious education. That needed to be this more pluralistic form of religious education. But despite that, we have real trouble getting humanism taught in schools on an equal footing with religious beliefs. And this is for a whole host of reasons that include the fact that some of the bodies which are run by local councils that produce the syllabus won't include humanists as voting members, despite the fact that, again, this is actually unlawful under human rights law, because religion should be understood as religion or belief. So those groups should include people with religious and non-religious worldviews equally. Some of the syllabuses that are produced just don't treat humanism equally, and then there's issues at the school level too. So lest this sound like a counsel of despair, it is worth saying that there are some improvements happening somewhere in the UK, and that somewhere is Wales. They're really leading the way with respect to improving this situation. So their proposed reforms in their new curriculum bill, which is set to be introduced from 2021, include explicitly putting humanism on an equal footing with religions in religious education, including in the bodies that write the syllabus and on the curriculum itself as well. They're also doing some interesting things. For example, they're going to get rid of the right to withdraw from religious education that there is in all schools, but in faith schools, because they teach this confessional type of religious education, because they teach it from one religious perspective, to prevent children being indoctrinated against their parents' wishes, because some people, their local school, particularly in rural Wales, might be a faith school, whether they have a faith or not. So those parents will have the right to demand a form of religious education which is in line with the locally agreed syllabus taught in community schools. And we think this is a really innovative solution to the problem of children who are in faith schools but may not be of the faith of the school. Of course, it's not exactly in line with our principles about children's rights, because we actually think that older children ought to be able to opt themselves into this more critical, pluralistic version of the subject. But again, a huge step in the right direction and one to keep an eye on. Another area that we work on, and you might have seen very recently, we had a news item on our website. It's been on our social media because there is a consultation out on this subject at the moment. And if you haven't already, I would really encourage you to have a look at our website and respond to this consultation on tightening the law on illegal schools. This is an area that we were leading the way on, actually. We worked with whistleblowers from these schools and journalists from the BBC to really bring attention to this subject. We've uncovered evidence of, initially it was hundreds, and it turns out it's actually thousands of children being taught in illegal religious schools in England. They often operate in dirty, unsafe conditions where there's a complete lack of safeguarding. And that can include that they're just in a building which isn't supposed to be a school, that it's lots of pupils crammed into one tiny room with no fire exit. It could be that they're above a shop, but there's access from the public just walking in to to kind of, they can come into the school and the children can walk out at will. When they have a religious character, the children are generally taught a very narrowly religious curriculum. The schools that we first exposed with relation to this subject were Jewish yeshivas in and around Stamford Hill, in Hackney in London, but there are also Muslim illegal schools and there are Christian illegal schools. And some of the pupils in these schools have been exposed to extremist material, and that might be extreme misogynistic material. It might be homophobic. It might be actually terrorist material as well, has been found at some of these places. Unfortunately, despite the fact that we first drew attention to this around 2014, 2015, and that led to the setting up of Ofsted's Unregistered Schools Unit, and we were the first external group to meet with them, and we were the ones who put them in touch with whistleblowers from these communities to actually find some of these schools initially. The regulation of unregistered schools, out of school settings and home education means that they have been allowed to continue to operate, and there are still thousands of children who are at risk in these settings. So problems include the law on what constitutes a school. So these illegal unregistered schools can teach a very narrow religious curriculum, and that actually benefits them, because legally speaking, you are only a school if you provide an education which is suitable for primary or secondary age pupils. So if you provide an education that's totally unsuitable, then you don't count as a school and no one can intervene in what you're doing. Ofsted don't have powers to seize evidence. They don't have powers to look at registers. The lack of regulation on home education means that these schools can say that they are supplementary education for home educated pupils, and because there's no register of those pupils, there's no way to check up on whether those pupils are actually home educated or whether they're receiving all of their education in these settings. So there needs to be really joined up regulation on these settings. Now, thankfully, the government is starting to make a move in the right direction on these things. It has launched this consultation on proposals that include widening what counts as a school, specifically designed actually to catch places of religious instruction, including yeshivas, which they're aware are still operating, but they're unable to crack down on. However, the pandemic meant that consultation was suspended for a bit. It's been relaunched now. There's still a lot of detail that needs fleshing out, and all the while, the children who have been identified in these schools are still going to them, and they're still being put at risk. Some of them are corporal punishment is used, for example. So, you know, this isn't even just about what they're taught, it's about the fact that they are unsafe, physically at risk, as well as the fact that they are receiving a subpar education. One of the whistleblowers we spoke to when we started all of these investigations said he left school with the education of your average 9 or 10-year-old, and he was unable to speak English, even though he had been born and brought up in the Jewish community in Stamford Hill. As I said, the government's made very, very slow progress on shutting illegal schools down. There have been just 4 successful prosecutions so far. 3 of those were Muslim schools. 1 was another form of illegal school that didn't have a religious character. But following our work, it has proposed these reforms, and I would really urge you to take a look at our website, and if you can respond, please do. We provide a sort of handy form that gives ideas of the sorts of things that you can respond if you feel that you don't have the expertise in order to kind of come up with a response from scratch. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that we don't have what I would call secular schools in England or in Wales or in Northern Ireland indeed, and collective worship is the reason why I think that this is the case. So all schools in England, even those without a designated religious character, must by law conduct a daily act of collective worship that's broadly Christian in character. Now, of course, during the current restrictions in schools, children are not assembling in the sort of ordinary assembly hall and assembling in big groups and having collective worship that way, but they are still having it via video link, and it can still happen in smaller groups in classrooms, etc. So although this isn't kind of happening on the mass scale that it was supposed to happen before the pandemic, it is still happening, and I've still got parents getting in touch about the issue. It's worth saying as well, because people sometimes think back to when they were in school and think back on assemblies and think, oh, well, isn't it just singing some songs and maybe a little bit of reflection on ethical and moral stories, and maybe, you know, a little bit of reading from the Bible? Isn't that just what worship means? Well, according to the most recent regulations on this, and when I say most recent, they were actually written in 1994 and have not been updated since, it means reverence or veneration paid to a divine being or power. So it very much excludes the non-religious, because we don't worship because we don't believe that there is a divine being or power. So reverence or veneration paid to them just doesn't work if you're non-religious. Now, that's why I would say there's no straightforwardly secular schools in England. There is a parental right to withdraw from collective worship, and sixth formers since 2016 are legally entitled to withdraw themselves from this practice. This is sometimes used as an argument against our campaigns against collective worship, because they say, well, you know, parents can just take their children out of it, that's not a problem. The reason we would say that that's no good is that withdrawal can be really, really difficult. Schools don't always understand the practice. They quite often expect children either to remain in the room and just sort of sit at the back of the room, or they are less than helpful in facilitating the request. Children sometimes get left in hallways or just in another classroom with an iPad. So you might be aware we took a court case last year which did win permission to be heard at the High Court, but actually then got settled out of court because the school rolled over and gave the parents in the case everything that they wanted. And that was about getting a meaningful alternative for children who'd been withdrawn from collective worship, because there's a lot of important stuff that goes on in assemblies. You know, it is worthwhile having ethical reflections and discussions about things that are happening in the news and stories and celebrating achievement and singing songs. But the fact that it has this religious character is deeply problematic for non-religious people, and we feel that there should at the very least be a meaningful alternative to it, or that it should be replaced with fully inclusive non-partisan assemblies. So they shouldn't come from a broadly and mainly Christian background. There should be no worship at all. It should be about celebrating the variety of identities that children in the school may have. And we think that that is much more suitable for the schools that we have without religious character particularly. And we would like to kind of move forward and see that as the future of assemblies. Okay, so that's a very short tour of all of the various issues that we cover. If there's anything that you think that I haven't covered in sufficient detail or that you want more information about, please do raise a question about it. But you might also be wondering, you know, how you can help with respect to all of these issues. And there are a variety of things that you can do. Launch local campaigns against proposals for religious free schools or fully selective voluntary aided schools if and when these arise. So far, there's only been one proposal for a new fully selective VA school, and that's going to be opening in Peterborough. Unfortunately, despite lots of local opposition against it, the council decided that they were going to wave that through. But every year there are new proposals for religious free schools, and although they're better in terms of less religious selection, it would still be better still to have a free school that had an open character and that children from all backgrounds should attend. We tend to, every year when the list is published, to publicise that on our website, and we will get in touch with local humanist groups if there's something in your area that we think that you could help us build up a grassroots campaign against. But we can't have our eyes everywhere all of the time, so if you spot something that you think should be on our horizon, please do get in touch. And if you're interested in kind of helping with a local campaign in that way, we'd be more than happy to hear from you. You might want to champion inclusive RE if you've got a child at your child's school, if you've got a grandchild similarly. And that might just be by asking for a humanist school speaker. So we run a school speakers program. It's entirely free. All of our speakers are trained, and it might just be that the reason that your child's school is not promoting inclusive RE is just that they haven't really thought much about it. So those are really productive conversations that you can have, and they don't have to be adversarial at all, but it can help to kind of plant the seed that grows into really good practice in your local school. Similarly, you might want to think about requesting a meaningful alternative to collective worship at your child's school. Interestingly enough, off the back of our court case with the Harrises that I mentioned in the part of the talk about collective worship, quite a lot of parents got in touch to say that they wanted to ask their school about providing such a thing. We think that the law suggests that this is what they ought to be doing. The DfE disagrees with us about this, but it might be the case that this will turn into a legal case further down the line. I don't know. It might be difficult at the moment because, of course, schools have quite a lot on their plate. But it might just be talking about having more inclusivity during worship or during assemblies again. And I have had situations with parents getting in touch about this where actually, after talking to a parent, there was a group who were going into schools acting out Bible stories that was very, very confessional in nature. And they were actually a group that was going into the school that the Harrises sent their children to as well. But in another case, through having a conversation with the head teacher, a group of parents actually managed to get that group not coming to the school anymore. The head teacher decided that it wasn't really appropriate for the range of pupils that they had in the school. So sometimes just having the conversation can bring fruitful results. But if you want to have a chat about what's going on at your child or grandchild's school, again, please do feel free to get in touch. Please do respond to any national or local consultations. We will always publicise these on our website, and if you're a member or a supporter, we send emails around about them. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter to receive updates on current campaigns and take actions. And that one on illegal schools is one that's still open, I think, for another couple of weeks. So I'd really encourage you, if you're interested in helping, to fill that out. So there's a whole variety of ways that you can help, and it's entirely possible that you may all have things in mind that maybe have been going on in your local area that you want to raise. And please do get in touch, because sometimes it's just like a little question like that actually prompts a whole new sort of area of work for us. A lot of the work that we do comes from what we get from parents and interested parties who are on the ground and able to tell us about things that are going on. So yes, please do help if you can, and don't hesitate to contact me if you've got a query about any of those things. Thanks.